Recorded live at Town Hall here at Miller Residence. This is AE Squared. Well, as you've probably gotten to know, our company is AE Squared is taken off. You know that aerospace and defense is something we take very seriously. And what we take seriously more than anything isn't just taking care of our customers, but also making sure that we're delivering value to the warfighter. And today, this is like the perfect storm, because tonight's guest knows how to save billions of dollars for DoD to both save expense, but also increase readiness. And the story you're going to hear tonight is both unique and profoundly exciting. And so we cannot wait to introduce you to tonight's guest. But first, here's a short video of what Red 6 is all about.
Augmented reality is a technology that will fundamentally redefine how we experience, share, and interact with our information, and with each other. However, there's a problem. In its current form, the technology faces two critical limitations. It doesn't work outdoors, and it doesn't work in dynamic environments.
At Red 6, we're tackling these challenges head-on, enabling real solutions to real problems.
We started by building a car racing system in virtual reality. It worked incredibly well, and now we're taking those principles and applying them to AR.
Red 6 has developed a unique solution to augmented reality that not only works outside, but in the most dynamic of environments.
Our technology is revolutionary, allowing real pilots and real airplanes to train against any synthetic enemy. And this solves an acutely defined pain point for the US military. Our training systems scale to allow joint training across multiple domains. Real people in real vehicles connected together in an augmented world.
We provide critical capabilities and cost savings for our commanders and service leadership alike.
Our patented approach to augmented reality and the development of industry-leading display technology will naturally evolve into civilian use cases.
This is not just a technological revolution. This is a social, human, and business revolution. This is the largest media inflection point in human history. And at Red 6, we're excited to be at the forefront of this journey.
Welcome to the AE Squared stage, the founder, pilot of Red 6, Daniel. It's so good to have you. Daniel Robinson.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Thank you. Daniel, this is the first time we've met.
Yep.
But your story has been foremost in my mind since I first learned about you just a few weeks ago. So I hope you don't mind, and I know that you've told this story before, but can we take a little bit and take the tape back and tell us about your background, from where you come from, and you have a really unique story that takes us all the way to the cockpit of an F-22.
Sure.
I'd love for you to tell that story.
Sure, absolutely. So I grew up in the northeast of England in the 1980s, so the middle of the kind of a big revolution and change going on in the UK at the time under Thatcherism. So an area, synonymous with coal mines and shipbuilding. It's that kind of town growing up. There wasn't much to do in the town, but we had one movie theater. And so the highlight of my week certainly was my old man would take me to the movie theater and we'd go see movies. I remember the first movie I saw was Superman. And that movie was so formative on my life because it ignited a passion for flying, from being a kid.
Sure.
My mom and dad would tell stories of me, standing outside for hours like this, trying to take off, and then running across a piano and diving off, and then running to catch me and save me, because I really wanted to fly from being a kid. I guess the next movie I saw was Star Wars, and I was kind of interested in lightsabers, but X-Wing fighters, that's where it was for me. And finally, when I was about 13 years old, I saw the movie Top Gun. And when I saw Top Gun, I thought, wow, that's actually a job. That's a job I'd really like to do. So I got to figure out how I need to do it. I wasn't at the best school, to put it mildly, at the time, and I had to figure a way to get out of there. To say I didn't necessarily have the encouragement from some of the teachers was probably an understatement as well. But I had really supportive parents. My first job as a kid, I was a milkman. So I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and deliver milk. And with the money I was saving up, I bought myself a flying lesson. And that right there ignited the spark. And once I started...
That's a lot of milk.
Right, that was a lot. That was a lot of milk and a lot of sleepless nights as well. But so I started out as a milkman delivering milk, and I got my first flying lesson. There was a guy there was a flying instructor there called Peter Gray, and Peter became a mentor of mine and pointed me in the direction of the Royal Air Force and kind of filled in these missing gaps as to how I would get from this school in the northeast of England via a scholarship to the Royal Air Force Academy, which is ultimately what I was successful in doing. So I went off to the Royal Air Force Academy, and I managed to get a pilot slot. And in those days, there was a kind of a backlog in the holding pipeline system for the Air Force. So we'd go through a flying course, and then we'd come to a grinding halt. So it took a little while to get through, and it was kind of interesting because the timing of it ultimately compounded to the point where I'd been in the flying training system for about 4.5 years, which is a long time. But ultimately, I popped out. I made it through, and suddenly I was a Royal Air Force fighter pilot, and I was flying Tornadoes for the RAF, a lifelong dream as a kid.
It's a heck of a plane.
I couldn't believe, it was a good airplane. Although I didn't know what was to come, right? So I get combat ready in about August of 2001. Well, we all know what happened.
You just were put on combat status a month before 9/11.
August of 2001, right? So we all know what happened the following month.
Right.
So the backdrop of the first chunk of my career was against the backdrop of operations in the Middle East. So we'd be backwards and forwards, and a really interesting formative part of my career, which involved obviously a lot of training.
Right.
I didn't realize then, but right then was the kind of the genesis of where ultimately Red 6 would lead me. It turns out I was okay with the airplane. I was pretty good at the up, down, left, right stuff. And one day my squadron commander came to see me, and I was very young at the time, relatively speaking. Generally, this happens after about 2 tours or 6 years on the airplane. So I'd done about 3 years on the airplane, and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in going to what you'd call here fighter weapons school, Top Gun?" And I said, "What?" and he said, "Would you be interested in going to fighter weapons school?" And of course I said, of course, absolutely. But it was very early on in my career. So they were kind of using me, I guess, as somewhat of a test bed. I think I was the first guy to ever go after only 3 years on the airplane. Right at the end of 3 years, I went to this school.
So let's just state the obvious. You were a little bit better than good enough in the left, right, up, down. You were really good.
I was okay, but there were other compounding, things going on in a broader sense, in that we were lacking experience on the front lines. A lot of pilots were leaving, and so there was a situation where, frankly, they needed people to go earlier. So I wouldn't say I was,
Got it.
It was a combination of timing, and I was reasonable with the airplane. So it was a big risk, and the boss had said to me, "Look, if you go to this school and you pull it off, it's going to change your life, change your career and everything. And obviously, if you don't, well, it may set you back a little bit, but you went early anyway." So I took the gamble, and when I got there, holy moly, it was a unique experience, an incredibly demanding course.
Where was it? Now, in the UK, where is that school?
The UK version was at a place called RAF Lucas, so just outside of St Andrews in Scotland, which was home of golf, right? So nice spot. But we didn't get to see much of the outside, so we were working long days. And by the skin of my teeth, I got through that course. It was, when I look at it in hindsight, I probably wasn't experienced enough to go to the school. But they took care of me. I was good with the airplane, but I just that broader sense of mature, tactical, strategic level thinking was not necessarily there at the time, and they had to build that in me. But I did get through the course. So I pop out of the course, and I go back to my squadron. I'm a frontline, I guess you'd call it here, like a Top Gun instructor or a fighter weapons school instructor. And from that come a number of opportunities. One of the opportunities you can expect to get if you're a graduate of fighter weapons school are great deals to come over to the United States and other countries on exchange. And there were a number of opportunities available. And the one I wanted, because I love Top Gun, I wanted to fly for the carriers, right? So I was obsessed with the F-14.
Right.
It's an old airplane now, and F-14 wasn't around at the time, but the F-18 was. So I'd applied for the F-18 exchange to the US Navy to come over here, and there was a short list of pilots. Ultimately, it was shortened down to 3. And we were waiting for the news. And it was one night after night flying, and the boss came into the squadron and said, "All right, everyone gather around." We were in the bar, as we tended to do as the Brits, so we were always in the bar after work. And we'd be having a few drinks, and he said, look, we all know we're here to hear about Dan and, you know, the news we've all been waiting for. And I thought, fantastic, this is it. I'm going to the Navy, and I'm going to fly Hornets off the carriers. He said, well, you know, he's made the shortlist for the F-18, but unfortunately, on this occasion, he's been unsuccessful. I was devastated, and I had a pint of Guinness. I started drinking it. And I was like, my God, it's the end of the world for me. He said, I'm really sorry. And people started consoling me. And after a couple of minutes, the boss said, look, there's a reason he hasn't got the F-18 exchange. And so I stopped.
You let that sit for a couple minutes.
Oh, yeah, he tortured me. And he said, the reason he hasn't got the F-18 exchange is he's just been selected as the first guy in the world outside of the US to fly the F-22 Raptor for the US Air Force.
Okay, what went through your mind? I have to admit, that was probably white noise at first.
Right, absolutely.
That's
well, the first thing I did was
crazy.
drop my Guinness.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
it fell on the floor, which is like a cardinal sin in the UK.
Right.
Next thing that happened is a bunch of guys jumped on top of me, beat me to the ground, and I was under this mass of bodies, and I kind of looked up and opened my eyes, and the boss was there, and he said, I said, is it true? He said, yeah. He said, very well deserved. And he pulled me up, shook my hand, and he said, look, young man, I'll never forget, he goes, young man, this is going to change your life in ways that you'll carry with you forever, and ways that you are not even aware of yet. And I said,
True words.
True words, absolutely. And 4 weeks later, I'm living on the beach in Florida, learning to fly F-22s. And I wasn't just it wasn't just that I was the only exchange pilot on the airplane at the time. I was one of the first guys ever to fly the airplane. We were at that initial cadre of bringing that airplane into service. And it was like a dream. And, you know, I find myself over the Gulf of Mexico at big, you know, great heights at 60,000 feet, looking down on the Gulf of Mexico, thinking, how did I get here from being this kid in the northeast of England to flying the F-22? And people always ask me, did you go back and tell that teacher that told you couldn't do it? And I never did. I never felt the need to.
Right.
But anyway, I spent 3 years flying the F-22 at Langley Air Force Base as an instructor pilot, and it was there that really I got to see firsthand some of the problems the United States Air Force and all air forces around the world are experiencing, and that is fundamentally, how do we train? Mm-hmm. Because if you think about it, every time a fighter pilot goes up to train, he needs someone to train against.
Go back to Top Gun.
Right, exactly. Right? And what does that mean?
The old A6s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It means an airplane, a pilot, a supply chain, fuel, logistics, everything that goes with that.
Whole Second Air Force.
And that is a multi-billion-dollar a year problem. And it's only getting worse. It's not just the U.S. Air Force that struggle with it. We struggle with it across the globe,
right.
All allied nations. And so it's compounded by a number of problems. It's incredibly expensive to train fighter pilots. It's an extremely demanding job. A lot of the guys are leaving. Right now, I think we're at our lowest state of readiness in history. So we're about 2,000 pilots short in the U.S. Air Force alone. And critically, whilst we've been involved in conflicts in the Middle East, you know, fighting the war on terror, the war on ISIS, critically important stuff, in the broader geopolitical landscape, two things have happened. You've seen the reemergence of Russia onto the world stage, and you've seen, crucially, the pace of innovation coming out of China and the technology. That's important and significant for a number of reasons. We used to enjoy such vastly technological superiority over near-peer adversaries. And in fact, you could say we never really had any near-peer adversaries if you're thinking about conventional conflict, nuclear conflict notwithstanding.
Right.
But now we're looking down the barrel of someone that is very, very credible. And that's important because how do we train against the kind of platforms like a J-20 coming out of China?
Right.
It's very difficult to do it. You know, we cannot use F-16s, F-18s, F-15s to simulate the MiG-29s and Su-27s. We could do.
There's no fidelity. It doesn't fly the same way.
It doesn't fly the same way. It doesn't have the same capabilities. So we need to be able to train against it, and we just couldn't do it. And so it was a really big problem for the Raptor community. And really, that was the genesis, I think, of the thought that I wanted to solve this problem. There must be another way to do this. As it happens, life would take me in a different direction. So in 2009, I decided for a number of reasons, personal and professional, to leave the Air Force. So I finished my Raptor exchange. It would be fair to say it was a shock to everyone, not least the Royal Air Force.
Sure.
Right? And it was a big decision on my part. But I elected to go do something else. So I left. I was lucky enough to go to Georgetown University for graduate school, and I finished my MBA at Georgetown. And I'd had a lifelong obsession with living in New York City. largely because of Superman flying down
Right,
Fifth Avenue
right,
like this,
right.
So I was obsessed with New York, and I wanted to go to New York and live there. So I got a great job out of business school. It was in finance. It wasn't something that I really wanted to do. I was passionate about, but
Investment
I thought,
banking
yeah,
type? Yeah.
investment management,
Yeah.
and it was something I thought, look, it's a great landing platform for business school into New York. I'll figure out, life will figure out where I'm going to go, but I'm going to get to New York and enjoy all that New York has to offer and learn finance. So I spent about a year or so in New York learning finance. To be quite honest, absolutely hated the job.
Yeah.
I knew very quickly that life inside a cubicle in a big building in Manhattan was not going to be for me at all. I felt like a caged animal, and my gosh, it was just those days of thinking about, whilst it was a great education and a wonderful experience, man, I will never go back to it.
Yeah.
And I was never destined to. And so we get to now the end of 2011, and life throws me a curveball that I could never have imagined. You can imagine it's the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, right smack bang in the middle of it. So I said I'd grown up in the town in the northeast of England with wonderful parents. My father started a business back when I was a kid that grew to be a fairly substantial employer in the town. We had about 150, 200 employees at any one time, and it was in commercial construction. It turns out that business was in a lot of trouble.
Right.
And my dad called me up one day and said, "Hey Dan, can you come back and help me? I'm lost." And I said, "Absolutely, I can come back. But if I come back, there was always that father-son dynamic going on, right? So I said, if I come back, you've got to, frankly, get out of my way.
Right.
Let me get into this and really look at this business objectively and analyze it. And there are going to be some difficult decisions. But I'll come back. I'll
Right.
take the first flight, which will be tomorrow morning. I'll be back with you on Wednesday afternoon." And we spoke on Skype that night. I remember looking at him thinking something was strange. And he said to me, "Dan, I'm not sure that's going to be soon enough." And it wasn't. And the next morning I woke up to the news that my father had taken his life that night. And my life was changed forever.
Yeah.
And so I woke up. I mean, I'd lost my best friend.
Yeah.
I'd lost my mentor, my dad. And all I could do was, I remember sitting there in New York thinking, don't let this break you. You've got a new mission now. And I jumped on the first flight back and went back to the northeast of England. My life was forever changed.
Right.
I had my mom and 3 sisters to take care of, but I discovered I'd inherited a business in the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, with 150 people looking at me going, "What are we going to do?" And the business is bankrupt. And the banker looked at me saying, "Hey, you're bankrupt." And I'm like, "I am fully aware."
On top
right.
of,
I'm fully
you
aware.
just lost your father.
Yeah, and so that was the Wednesday. I walked into work and I got the management team together and I said, "Look, I want the whole company in front of me the next morning, Thursday." Went home, took care of my mom and my sisters. And Thursday morning I walked into work and I stood in front of everyone. And I said, "Guys, I'm gonna tell you the truth."
Yeah.
They'd all loved my dad. We're a big family business, right? But the truth is my father committed suicide and the business is in trouble.
Right.
And it was a defining moment for me in both leadership and management, because it was that moment where I was either going to grab the team and inspire them to follow me on a very difficult journey,
Right.
or we were done.
Right.
And so I said to them, the next 6 months are the biggest battle of our professional careers, right? But it ultimately comes down to what we decide today. And I think if you look around and you understand the culture and the nature of this business as a family business, we need to stand by each other, and we need to get ourselves out of this. We owe it to each other. We owe it to my dad. And I said, "I absolutely know how to do this." Pinocchio. I had no idea how to do this, right? But I absolutely know what I'm doing here, fellas.
This is all within like a week of all of this going
This is
down.
2 days after my dad
2
committed
days.
suicide. I said, "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sacrifices collectively as a team. And I'm going to ask the apprentices, your bosses are going to sacrifice more than you. The managers, you're going to sacrifice more than the line guys. The directors will sacrifice more than the managers, and I'll sacrifice more than any of you." and I'm going to lead us through this. And so in that moment, I got the team to follow me on this journey. I walked out of that meeting into a meeting with my financial director, and I looked at the balance sheet of the company and the P&L and went, oh God,
Yeah.
how am I going to do this?
Right.
And long story short, I did it. I got the bank to back me. And over the course of 6 years or so, I turned that business around, and ultimately, successfully, to a successful exit, I sold the business. And it was a wonderful journey and a critical part of my leadership journey and management journey, because it was like going to business school and being given the worst case business case you could possibly imagine, from operations to strategy to culture to organizational change. I had to drive through change and everything. And to do that with no money in the bank, having just lost my father, was a tremendous test. But it was one which ultimately we were successful, and the business was ultimately sold successfully. We were able to take care of the family and critically take care of all of these employees and their pensions and everything. So
Right.
it was a job well done. At the end of that, there was great personal cost to me. I was exhausted and really unhappy, and I needed to find my next challenge, and I needed to find myself. So I came back out to the United States. Initially moved back to New York. And New York was just full of sad memories for me at that point in time. So I was like, I need a new change. So I came to California. And I asked myself the simple questions: if I was going to spend the rest of if I knew when my life would end, how would I spend my time?
Right.
What does happiness mean to me? And it occurred to me that I was in love with flying. And I've been in love with flying since I was a kid. And I used to be a pretty reasonable pilot. So I walked to a flight school in Santa Monica, and I said, hey guys, I'd like to learn to fly. And this,
Did they have any idea who you were?
so this kid takes me flying. He's 20 years old, and he's
Right.
like, okay, here's straight and level. He goes, very good. So here's a turn. He's like, man, that's pretty good. Yeah, well done. Here's a steep turn. He goes, man, you've really got this. So we land, and we're walking in from the airplane. He said, you might have some potential as a pilot. And I said to the guy, I should bloody hope so, right? And I said, look, I have to tell you my background. So long story short, I get my pilot's license back. This is another building block heading towards Red 6. Sitting in the hangar every day of that flight school was a beautiful airplane called a Berkut Experimental.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
the thing you saw on the promo video.
Yeah.
And the designer and creator of that airplane was sitting right there in the hangar with it. So we struck up a friendship, and we were working on the airplane. He'd let me just change brakes.
Right.
Just doing manual labor, learning airplanes and stripping engines apart and everything. It was a great experience. And one day I decided, I'd really love to build an airplane. This is my next passion project. So I said, hey, Dave, I'd like to build an airplane. Great, he said. I'd like to build a Berkut. Would you help me? He said, absolutely not. And I said, why? He said, Dan, this airplane has cost me a lot. It cost me my business. And my best friend was a former demo pilot who was killed in this airplane in a G-lock accident. So G-induced loss of consciousness back, I think around about, ironically, the time I joined the Air Force.
Right.
The gentleman's name was Rick Fessenden, who's a former F-18 Navy pilot. So Rick had been killed back in the day, and so I just backed off and respected Dave's decision. A couple of months later, I come into the hangar, and Dave's airplane's parked outside, and he said, jump in the back seat. I said, where are we going, Dave? He said, I'll show you. So we jumped in the airplane, we flew down to Temecula.
Yep.
And in Temecula, we were met in the desert by a gentleman called Samuel Puma. And Samuel Puma was a fighter pilot of a bygone era, Vietnam, as bow-legged as it gets, with a big smile on his face and a song. And he took me to his house in the middle of the desert. I met his wife. They were very gracious. We had a wonderful lunch. But I didn't know why we were there.
Right.
At the end of lunch, Sam said to Dave, well, shall we show him? I said, show me what? And they took me into the desert, and in the desert was a big barn. And in the barn, under a tarpaulin, was one remaining Berkut kit. And Dave looked at me and said, this was Rick Fessenden's airplane.
Oh my gosh.
He said, this has been sitting in the desert 21 years waiting for you. It's the last airplane I'm ever going to build. Now, this is the guy who designed and created Berkut. So it was kind of a spooky kind of moment in my life of wow. So I committed in that moment for no other reason than to build the best version of the Berkut I could build. And I didn't know why, but life was pointing me in the direction, go build that airplane.
Right.
And so in the negotiations of this airplane, I should say back when I came to the F-22, you may all be aware that the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy have a culture of giving call signs to their pilots, like Maverick and Goose, right? Yeah. We don't do that in the UK. So when I came over here, because everyone was super experienced that was on the Raptor, I was the only guy that but didn't have a call sign.
Right.
And because I had all the security clearances, I was parented by the British Embassy. They all thought I was a spy. I got the call sign Bond, right? So
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so everyone knows me as Bond within the military.
Yeah.
And that's significant for one reason. So fast forward now, what, 16, 17 years?
I would have picked one of Hugh Jackman's roles personally, just getting to know you, but we'll go with
I
that.
get that a lot. It's
Yeah.
interesting, yeah. And so I'm fast forward now 16 years later, 11, 12 years later, I'm in the desert with Sam negotiating to buy this airplane from him.
Right.
And he calls me up one day, he doesn't know any of this. He calls me up one day, he said, Dan, hey, I dug out the paperwork on this airplane. He goes, it was one of the very early pre-production versions. Serial number on this airplane is 007. And I said, Sam, are you kidding me? He said, no. I said, let me tell you a story. And I told him the story,
Yeah.
and he said, look, take the airplane, it's yours.
You're
it was
kidding.
meant to be. He said, take it. He said, you pay me when you can, take the airplane.
Yeah.
So life was saying, Dan, build this airplane.
this airplane.
And I did. I started building the airplane. It made no sense at all.
Now, you've built buildings. Building an airplane's a whole different deal.
Oh, yeah, yeah. They say building an airplane will cost you 2.25 girlfriends per airplane. And that's about to,
I won't ask you what the truth was.
that's about
Yeah.
right. That's about right. It's extremely demanding. So we set about building this airplane. And I can't say it any clearer than this. Quite serendipitously, into my life walked three individuals. And they all had rich backgrounds in VR and AR in particular.
Right.
And two of the guys had built something which you'll see called virtual drift. And it was a world first in virtual reality. And it was really exciting because what they'd managed to do is they took a real race car driver, put them in a real race car on a real racetrack in the UK. Simultaneously, they took a real race car driver, real racetrack, real race car, put them in the US. Both of these drivers went into virtual reality helmets, met each other in a virtual world, and raced real race cars around a track, blind to the outside world, against each other. And when I saw that, I thought, huh. And I immediately started connecting the dots, thinking about the training problem with the US Air Force.
Yeah.
So the first question I ask is, guys, is that possible in airplanes? And they look at me and they scratch their heads and they think, theoretically, yes, technically complex, but yeah, we could see a pathway to that. And the next question I ask is, well, look, no one's going to allow fighter pilots to fly around in a virtual reality world,
Right.
in a virtual space. The difference being an entirely different virtual world versus, virtual entities into the real world. So the next question I ask is that possible in augmented reality rather than virtual reality? To which they look at me as if I was an idiot, quite frankly, and said,
Right.
no, absolutely not. I said, why? And they said, because augmented reality doesn't work outdoors and it doesn't work in dynamic environments. I said, why?
Yeah.
And I kept asking why until we came up with a thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And the thesis was, look, if we approach this building upon the IP that the guys have built in virtual reality in a slightly different way to the AR industry, could we theoretically make this work in airplanes? Because if we can, my idea was, what if I could put virtual airplanes into the real world?
Right.
And if I can put virtual airplanes into the real world, that would allow fighter pilots to go train against anything, provided we had the intelligence on the platform, et cetera, et cetera. And so we started getting excited by this. We took about 2 weeks break from the building of the airplane. We sat down and we really sort of thrashed this out into what would a business plan look like, what would a technical roadmap look like. I thought, okay, I think we've got a chance of this. So I obviously had a certain amount of credibility and capital, I guess, political
Right.
capital within the
So-
Air Force. So I called the Air Force up quite literally one day and said, hey, I think I can save you billions of dollars, solve your pilot problem, and solve Red Air as well at the same time. And the guy on the end of the phone
Humble
was
statement to me.
Yeah. And so the Air Force went, go on.
Yeah.
And so we continued the conversation. They said, okay, come out to Las Vegas and meet AFWorks. AFWorks,
Yeah.
you may see them here in
Yep.
Austin at
Right.
the Capital Factory. AFWorks was set up as the innovation arm of the Air Force. And their idea or their remit was to grab private sector, small, innovative startups, interesting technology, put their arms around them and help them into the Air Force, help them into the military procurement cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And so we met with AFWorks. It was a classic meeting, 2:30 in the morning in a nightclub in Vegas. I pitched
You
them.
do some of your best work in bars.
I do a lot of my
Yeah.
best work in bars, it's true. So we sat there with the guys, and I said, look, this is my idea. Is this interesting to you? And
Right.
they said, actually, yeah, it's absolutely interesting. But as an acid test, we'll have you speak to the Air Force Research Laboratory. And the Air Force Research Laboratory, I called them up, and I said, hey, this is me. This is what we're doing. And they said, okay, we've been working on a system called Live Virtual Constructor for the past 5 years. to solve, in essence, the same problem I'd identified. So the idea was, rather than put physical assets, pilots, and airplanes up into the real world, can we link pilots in simulators on the ground with constructive and AI-generated assets and beam them up into the real world such that pilots flying around can see them on their radar scope?
Right.
And the trials and the technology is very, very successful, with the exception of one thing. And that is, it's a 50% solution. The reason it's a 50% solution, if you bear with me, is the job of a fighter pilot is twofold, right? It's a beyond visual range, beyond the range that I can physically see with my eyeballs. We're using sensors to locate, track, identify, target, and shoot other targets out there. But that's done on our systems, our radar scopes.
Right.
You know, we see them, we never see them. We do this a long way away. As those ranges collapse, the role of a fighter pilot from about 10 miles inwards changes from tactician, mission commander, chess player, to, you know, you're putting a gum shield in, you're going for a fist fight.
Right.
The type of stuff you experience in Top Gun, you know, the
Right.
dogfighting around each other. And the problem is, inside of 10 nautical miles, the live virtual ecosystem collapses. Live virtual constructive ecosystem collapses. Why
Just
is
because
that?
it can't update fast enough.
Sort of.
Sort
but
of.
Not really.
Okay.
In fact, no.
Okay.
So
Swing and a miss.
the reason it collapses is there is no way of visually portraying those airplanes to the pilot in the real world. So synthetically they are there, the radar scopes think they're there, but as soon as they come within visual range and I start transitioning my lookout from inside my
Here to
cockpit
up.
to the radar to where is he in space, I'm going to go have a fight.
Right.
There's no one there. Or at least 2 out of the 3 are not there. Obviously the live guy is there,
Right.
the virtual guy is not, and the constructive guy is not.
But could you leverage what's already on your heads-up display in a more... I mean, when you start talking this, I think of the HUD
You're thinking
going-
the head-up displays, but
Yeah.
they're fundamentally targeting solutions, right?
Right.
So the reason they're not there is because there's no way of putting synthetic targets into the visual field of view of a pilot. Why is that? Because augmented reality doesn't work outdoors in dynamic environments. It's a nascent technology.
Right.
Well, it does now. And that's the piece of the jigsaw that we've solved. So I pitched this to AFRL, and quite literally they said, guys, we've been looking for this for 5 years. No one has solved this. Northrop Grumman wanted to solve it. It was on their roadmap for 2035. So we're like, guys, we've solved this. We know how to do this. And so the Air Force got their arms around us and said, look, these are some big claims you're making, right? We're going to need to see some evidence. And so we set about a roadmap. They gave us 2 targets to aim towards. The first was a demonstration of our thesis to augmented reality in a cockpit, albeit on a static environment on the ground. And what I mean by that is, the airplane we were building, that I was supposed to build, became the perfect test platform for this. So as we're building the Berkut out, we start building the technology into it. And so back in February, it was our first notable milestone. We were self-financing at that point in time. We got a little bit of funding from the AFWorks and the Air Force, but nothing major. It was largely our own capital, our own investment, our own sweat and tears and love. And back in February, we had 12 guests from the United States Air Force, from Test Pilot School, Air Force Research Lab, AFWorks, Air Combat Command, Air Education Training Command. They all came to see this. And what we demonstrated to them in a static environment on the ground was these guys sat in the front cockpit of the Berkut. They put a headset on that we created, and they flew an augmented reality mission. So they flew up to a tanker. There was a tanker airplane right above them. They took gas from a tanker. They came off the tanker. They had an F-22 on their wing.
Right.
They flew downrange, and they did a 2v2 intercept against 2 Russian PAC FAs. They killed one beyond visual range. They went to the visual merge with the next guy, and they had a dogfight, and it was successful. So obviously it was really exciting.
Yeah.
Off the back of that, they said, guys, we're going to support this. And we were awarded a Small Business Innovation Research Grant, SIBA Phase 1. And that was our first official contract with the Air Force. And they gave us the next version. Okay, there is a world of difference between showing us this on the ground and your claims that this is going to work in the air.
Right.
So what we'd like you to do is obviously prove it works in the air, but let's just take our time. The first thing we'd like you to do is fix a static object in the air.
Right.
So put a shape that we can maneuver around in relation to and through to prove
That's
that
the cube in the promo?
that's the cube in the
cube.
promo.
Got it.
And that was our choice. We
Right.
could choose anything. And I elected to make a wired cube such that, yes, we could maneuver around it. But the immersive aspect of it is when you fly through this cube and it surrounds you,
Right.
it suspends, but you know, you're there and you're like, wow, this
Right.
is pretty incredible. So much so that when I fly through with the airplane, I'm very careful not to hit the walls of the cube with the wings of the airplane.
Yeah.
It's that immersive an experience.
So there's a lot of sensor fusion that's going into this and hardware design. You've got to work with the Garmins or whoever is doing the standard avionics, you got to take a lot of telemetry.
There's a lot involved, right?
Yeah,
And therein lies
yeah.
the problem. How do we can we solve this out in the real world?
Right.
And so from February, we set about on that pathway. Obviously, we needed finance to do that.
Right.
And we were very lucky that we had a lead investor that was willing to take a chance on us. And they're based right here in Austin. They're Moonshot's capital. And if you get the chance, Craig Cummings is in the audience. Say hello to Craig. But Moonshots, Craig Cummings, Kelly Purdue took a gamble. And they looked at us. Their thesis was that leadership prevails.
Yep.
Where's the best place that trains leadership? The military academies. So I guess they gambled on myself and the team. Right. Because we still had a long way to go with the tech. But that enabled us on our pathway towards an airborne demonstration. So we raised a $2.5 million seed round led by Moonshots. And we worked very closely with the Air Force out to the point where you're joining us right now.
Yeah.
And just last week, we flew successfully the world's first ever augmented reality air-to-air refueling sortie. So what do I mean by that? I mean, I sat in the front cockpit of an airplane. We had an Air Force pilot in the back seat with me in the Berkut. Mm-hmm. We took off into Southern California, and we went up into an augmented world that we've created in the sky. And I took them to the cube, and we flew around the cube, and that was our criteria for success.
Right.
That was what the Air Force wanted to see. It was our definition of success.
Right.
But we'd already gone well beyond that.
Right.
So we went beyond that, and we started looking at dynamic maneuvering targets, because I understood as a pilot and an operator that the test community and the tech community would look at that and go, holy moly, these guys have solved augmented reality outdoors at 300 miles an hour up in the sky. That's technically very significant. But to the operator, to the warfighter, what they will understand is I see an airplane out there.
That's right.
And I see an airplane that I can fly with. And my gosh, it's a KC-46 tanker with an F-22
Right.
on the wing.
Right.
And I can put that target into a shoot list. I can transition from beyond visual range, and as I get there, I spot it in my headset, it gets closer, and as I get closer, my gosh, it's a tanker. And I pull in behind the tanker, and now there's a boom sticking out of the tanker, and I can go plug.
Yes.
And so this augmented reality immersive experience, we've gone well beyond that which was our definition of success. I'm pleased to announce that just recently the Air Force acknowledged as such, and we were awarded a Small Business Innovation Research Grant, Phase 2, which was a much bigger amount of money. It was a $1.5 million grant. And now we're working lockstep in partnership with the Air Force now. And the aim in the next year is to get this technology into an Air Force cockpit. And this is where we join us today.
So that's a big story. I got to imagine that the major players putting LRUs in cockpits are starting to pay attention.
It would be fair to say that we're getting a lot of phone calls right now and
Right.
LinkedIn requests and emails. It will come as no surprise to anyone that this opens up an entirely new paradigm in training.
Yes.
We've solved the missing piece of what LVC offers.
Right.
And so, most of, if not all of the major primes are in touch with us. They're all coming out to see the demonstration of the technology.
Right.
There's significant interest across the industry, not just within the major players that you'd expect, the likely, the usual suspects, but some that you wouldn't expect as well, because this technology has application not just for the military and not just for air combat training, but if we've solved this outdoors at 300 miles an hour in 3 dimensions, barrel rolling around things.
Right.
By definition, we've solved it in any vehicle out there. And
Interesting.
so this scales from a market opportunity which is multi-billion dollars a year in the U.S. Air Force to U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps, where we don't just train by ourselves and fight by ourselves as one nation. There's an allied force. Mm-hmm. Everyone's suffering the same problems, so we scale to the Royal Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force.
Right.
So there's interest from many parties right now. The market opportunity is really large, and it doesn't stop there, because then you start looking at all other services across the nation, across just multi-domains. Mm-hmm. What do the Army do? What do the Marine Corps do?
Right.
What do our
Right.
warfighters on the ground do? There is a need for this. And again, extrapolate that across all nations. It's a big opportunity.
Would it be fair to say that as you look forward, the thing, I go back to Top Gun,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're flying against old A6s.
Yep.
Today's aggressors are flying 16s and F-18s or whatnot that they historically would fly against. But you brought up this new Chinese aircraft
Yep.
and Russians. It would seem that you actually could heighten the level of training or stress that you put in the pilot by synthetically duplicating an actual threat platform rather than an aggressor trying to mimic one, right?
It's exactly the right question to ask, and frankly, exactly the purpose of the technology.
Right.
The reason being, and my thesis is this: putting physical assets into the airspace is extremely expensive, right? And if it's not relevant, you have to question why are we doing it.
Mm-hmm.
With a combination of LVC and ATARs, which is what we call our system, we allow a total solution. So if that is the case, then why do we ever need to put physical assets and pilots up into the airspace
Right.
again to provide red air? We don't. So I envision a future where we're not doing that at all. And so, there's an enormous opportunity cost for pilots as well going up
Yeah.
to provide red air, because whilst they're doing that, they're not training what they should be doing.
Right.
That is blue air.
Yeah.
Kill bad guys.
Right.
That's our job. And whilst to the layperson looking out, they see people flying airplanes, the training value for us is very limited. So there's massive opportunity cost there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think we need to do this anymore.
No.
It's a little way off, but I envision a future where every single red air sortie is a synthetically generated target. Because you're quite right. If we have the intelligence on the platforms,
Right.
then we can accurately replicate the kind of things we'd be going against in conflict. And oh, by the way, we can scale it to an intensity level up or down as we see fit.
Mm-hmm.
So there are customized training solutions as well. And it doesn't stop there. If you think about how we physically train and produce baby pilots, it's asset intensive.
Right.
Right? We're desperately sure we need to get these guys and girls to the front line as quickly as possible. And what ATARS offers is an alternative solution to training pilots. Every time a pilot goes up as learning to be a wingman, he needs a wingman.
Right.
Right? Well, how
Right.
do you generate that?
Right.
With physical assets. Well, you don't need to anymore.
Right.
So the value of ATARs extends up and down the value train. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, if you think about the broader consumer market for spatial computing, I think one of the things we've all lamented with spatial computing and AR as an industry as a whole is it's a it's a very interesting technology.
Right.
But fundamentally it's an indoor solution only because of some of the limitations of it. So I can put a pink elephant on a table,
Right.
and it can look great and everything, but who cares?
Yeah.
What's the use case for that? So it would be fair to say that in a broader sense, there is no consumer applications for spatial computing right now. But that's not to say it won't come. It will come. And I think a ubiquitous spatial computing future will only be realizable if two things happen. It's mobile in nature and it works outdoors. Until those two problems are solved, it will be a solution in search of a problem. So ATARS offers us an interesting pathway to a really big inflection point, which I think represents perhaps the single biggest inflection point in media and how we consume and share and interact with our information since computers went to cell phones. A spatial computing future represents that, but it's not here yet for the consumer. There are a number of other reasons, form factor, battery
Right.
power, a number of challenges we have to overcome. But that market will arrive, and when it arrives, it's $1 trillion market. The question is, in what state are you as a company when that market arrives?
Right, exactly.
Are you still alive? Have you got tech that's relevant? Have you solved the correct problems?
Yeah.
And so
Do you have the capability to scale to accommodate it?
Absolutely,
That's-
absolutely. And what's the
Right.
pathway to that?
Right.
I think some of the major players out there are realizing that consumer market does not exist, so they're pivoting into enterprise plays. Well,
Right.
the pathway that Red 6 has with ATARS is kind of backing into something because we're not a solution in search of a problem. We've identified a critical problem,
Right.
an acutely defined pain point, and we're taking AR and going, hey, we've approached AR in a fundamentally different way that solves an acutely defined pain point for across all domains, across all militaries.
Can you envision, as you're sitting here talking, I would imagine in your role, you want to stay focused on the problem at hand and not look left and right necessarily in other industries and nail this. But as a person with 4 children,
Right.
the last of which just got their driver's license, I can see a commercial application for driver's ed in there commercially. But can you envision an operational use model?
Yes.
Not just a training model?
It's an excellent question, and the answer is absolutely yes.
What would that look like?
Maybe a little too premature for me to
Right,
go
fair
into
enough.
because we're working on some very specific use cases right now
Right.
that are, look, ultimately for me, what am I passionate about? It's getting capabilities to the warfighters.
Exactly.
Right? We quickly identified in this journey that this has huge utility for training.
Exactly.
But critically, it has absolute utility for the warfighter, the ability to shorten the kill chain
Right.
the ability to save lives.
Right.
And so outside the remit of the tests we're doing for the Air Force right now, we're simultaneously working on some very interesting applications for warfighting.
Yeah, I just being that we're defense related as well, and seeing the innovation that others are doing with the concept of loyal wingman and things of that, I can envision down that road some very interesting
Sure.
IP. So in general, though, to wrap things up, you and I get together again, have a Guinness.
Yep.
3 years from today.
Yep.
What's Red 6 going to look like?
That's an interesting question. Let me approach it in a different way.
Okay.
What does training look like for the military?
Better question.
Right? Training for the military. In 3 years from now, I'd like to see wide-scale adoption of the ATOS system, certainly for our flyers, for sure. And it scales across that, because ultimately that's what we're passionate about.
Right.
Red 6 will, the company will evolve. Red 6 is going to be successful, but it will be successful as a byproduct of doing something well that we're absolutely passionate about.
Right.
And that is getting capability to the warfighter. So I'll focus on that, and I think Red 6 will take care of itself.
In the end, you're going to save billions of dollars for DoD, but probably more profound for parents of people there. I think you're going to keep a lot more airmen coming home at night too.
I think so, and that's absolutely the aim, for sure.
Thank you very much for what you're delivering to the warfighter, both here and across all of our allies. It's a blessing to meet you, Daniel. Welcome
so
to E
much.
Squared.
Thank you for your time.
You bet. Great interview.
Two racers, two separate tracks, but we're united on one virtual racetrack.
This is on another level. You've got the real physical forces combined with this mad world of the huge boulder flying through the sky, there's steam coming out of the ground. It's pretty amazing what the brain can cope with, and we're absolutely pushing that to the limit.
3, 2, 1, go!
Type of experience definitely opens up a ton of possibilities. I never even conceived that this was possible.
AE Squared is a Hiller Measurements Town Hall production. Copyright 2020. AE Squared is produced by Anthony Longoria. Production support by Christian Zamora. The email address, if you'd like to attend a future taping, is tickets@hillermej.com.